Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all to this first general webinar that has ever been run by the IUSSP. This event has attracted a great deal of interest on the part of IUSSP members. About 600 people have signed up. And as this is a bit more than our Zoom capacity, unfortunately, a few latecomers may not be able to sign on, but this is being broadcasted and recorded, so you will be able to watch, those people will be able to watch it later on. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has halted the IUSSP's usual program of seminars, workshops, meetings, and small thematic conferences for the moment. Over 20 events were planned for 2020, which have had to be postponed or reprogrammed. These meetings bring people together from around the world for several days to discuss recent research, and they're very difficult to replace in terms of their ability to facilitate discussion and forge ties between scholars and at times policymakers from across the globe. As on-site meetings are impossible for the moment, many IUSSP panels are carrying out their activities via virtual meetings. For some, this is a new learning experience, so there may be rough places and we urge you to be patient, while for others, they have a long history of holding cyber events. A case in point was the Population Environment Research Network webinar on Monday, last Monday, on population climate change and food security, which attracted also around 600 people. Please keep tuned into the IUSSP website, as we will be posting news of other webinars and other events. While we hope that IUSSP seminars will start to become possible again sometime within the next year, we'd also like to see webinars become a regular part of IUSSP activities, as they allow us to engage a broader range of population experts from across the world than is possible through typical research seminars. We hope you agree, and I encourage you to propose topics and speakers for future upcoming webinars. The next webinar will take place on June the 8th, and that will be the 2020 IUSSP Laureate Ceremony, which will recognize the lifetime achievements of Gordon DeJong of Pennsylvania State University. It's programmed to start at 9 a.m. New York time or 5 p.m. European Paris time. Also of interest to today's topic, Stefan Helleringer has been maintaining an IUSSP resource webpage on demographers' contributions to the understanding of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can link to that on the IUSSP homepage. Okay, today's webinar is on the topic of positioning population studies to understand the short and long-term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the roundtable discussion will be moderated by Zeba Zattar, who is a senior associate and the country director for Pakistan for the Population Council. Mary Ellen Zupin, the IUSSP executive director, will assist her in collating questions from the audience. And I ask you not to be upset if we cannot ask your question, given the very large number of participants, and so we expect questions. The three panelists are Alberto Palloni, IUSSP 2019 laureate. He taught many years at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and is also a researcher at the Instituto de Economía, Geografía y Demografía in Madrid. Second panelist is Parfait Elundu Inyegi, chair of the Department of Development Sociology at Cornell University in New York State, and originally from Cameroon. And the last panelist is Sonal Desai, professor at the University of Maryland, and also professor and center director at the NCAER National Data Innovation Center in New Delhi. As today's event was inspired by a blog written by Alberto and Stefan Walter, Alberto will speak first, presenting his ideas. This will be followed by questions addressed to the other panelists by Zeba, and then we will open it to questions sent in by the audience. We'll end up by giving a final word back to each of the panelists. Again, I want to thank you for your interest and ask you to please stay tuned to hear of upcoming IUSSP webinars. Mary Ellen Zupin will now provide some information on how this webinar is organized and how it will work. Thank you.
Hi, welcome everybody to IUSSP's first webinar. We're really thrilled that so many of you could make it and so many of you were interested in attending. I will say we overbooked this webinar, so not everyone may be able to get in, but we hope most of you who want to attend will manage to get online. Before the webinar begins, I want to provide you with some instructions to help us make today's webinar a success. So, yes. After the presentation by Alberto and the discussion with Zeba Sitar, Sonal Desai and Parfait Elendu Nyege will have 20 minutes for panelists to respond to questions from the audience. For the Q&A to succeed, we'll need your collaboration. For those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom webinars, you'll see a Q&A on the bottom in the middle of your screen. When you click it open, it opens up and you might want to move it to the side so it doesn't block your vision of either the PowerPoint or the person speaking. What we want you to do is while people are speaking early, to start putting up your questions. This is so that we have the questions ready and can have reviewed them before the Q&A begins. If the question is to be addressed to one panelist, could you kindly indicate their name in your question? If it's for all panelists, which would be great, just put all panelists. Given that there's such a large number of attendees, we'd like to help us crowdsource these questions by giving a thumbs up to questions that you like. And there's a little thumb up on the side that you should be able to do that. You should also scroll down the Q&A to see all the questions listed. If you want to submit a question, keep in mind that if there's a similar question to yours that's already there, it's probably more efficient to like the question that's similar to yours and add a comment if you want to broaden its scope. And as you do that, when you vote them up, they move up in the queue and we're able to see them earlier. And we know they're the most popular questions that are there. And I think, so this is all new to us. It's the first time that we've ever done one of these webinars. So there's likely to be some technical glitches that could be caused either by your connection, by our connection. We're all doing this from home, from our computers. Many of us are working on Wi-Fi. What we'd like you to do at the end, so that we do this better the next time, is to respond to the survey that you will get when the webinar closes. And let us know what worked, what didn't work, what you liked, what you didn't, and also where you are connecting from so that we know what connectivity is like in your part of the world. We're experimenting with Zoom. We may try other webinar platforms, and we need to know how those function for you. And now, I think we've given you the information. We look forward to your questions, and I'm going to turn this over to Alberto Poloni to provide his PowerPoint. And I will stop my share, and hopefully Alberto will be able to start his share. Alberto, you're next. Well,
okay, can you all see, at least the ones who I want to start by thanking IOSSP and in particular Mary Ellen, Paul, Tom, and Nico, and the Council for supporting and organizing this webinar. The blog on which the webinar is loosely based was written in collaboration with my colleague Stefan Walter, who I hope is here to ensure that I get things right, including those that were wrong in the original version. The content of the presentation is unfortunately lopsided towards experiences of middle to high income countries, but I trust that the audience will be able to generalize the theme to other populations. The blog started with two questions. What exactly is it that we would like to know about the 1919 flu long-term effects of population? And if we had been able to travel back in time in a time machine, how would we have organized the data collection to address those problems? In these slides, I list only what we know about the 1918 flu. I'm sure that there's more, but I don't think there's much more. We know about the influence of fetal and early exposure. There's a body of research that uses the 1918 pandemic as a quasi-natural experiment to understand long-term effects of these types of exposures on adult health, on child nutritional status, with all the implication that that has for cognitive and non-cognitive skills. There's some work on economic crisis, restructuring, and social disorganization that followed but this is scarce, mostly because we can't roll back the tape and rerun it with no 1918 pandemic, so that we will never know for sure what those changes were. In this slide, I list a number of issues that we would like to investigate in this webinar. I would like to invite you to board a time machine and go back to the period June 1918, June 1919. And to board this time machine, you do not need a ticket, but you need to be equipped with the following: a stock of modern knowledge, methods, techniques, and technologies we are able to deploy today to do our research, and the questions researchers in multiple fields have been asking about the long-term consequences of the 1918 flu. When we get to destination, we may ask the question we are asking now: how to position population study to shed light on our questions with the theories, methods, techniques, and technologies that we have today. And I list here a number of areas, and I will go very quickly over them. First of all, collect very good data on number of cases, number of deaths, and their trajectories over time and space. This would illuminate some of the mathematical models that have been used, and that will make more precise the interventions that we have to implement. Collect data to understand the influence of embryonic, fetal, infant, child, and adolescent exposures on the risk to develop type 2 diabetes and, say, cardiovascular disease or obesity. Make sure you get the biomarkers of all sorts to be able to sample blood proteins, sequence the DNA and the epigenome that we know now are important. Data to assess the effects of development of traits during childhood and adolescence that determine social stratification and inequality. For example, influences on cognitive and non-cognitive skills and education. Track demographic outcomes, residential arrangements, marriage, fertility. And importantly, because I will repeat this several times, design observational study to investigate potential inter and transgenerational effects. That is not just the effects on those who experience the flu, but also on their offspring. I'm biased and very interested in the inter and transgenerational consequence of pre-pregnancy, embryonic, fetal, and early childhood exposure on health. This is an area where the bulk of research on the effects of 1918 flu pandemic has taken place. But it's a frustrating enterprise because the information we have available is scarce. A longitudinal study of pregnant women at the time would have helped. We should have collected also blood sample for those exposed to the 1918 flu. But nobody at the time would have thought how useful could have been the samples for us today. After all, little was known about DNA and epigenetics, let alone other proteins. This brings me to something very important. What we think would be good to position population studies today is highly dependent on the state of our knowledge today and cannot be influenced by discoveries that will be made between now and, say, 50 years from now, when you or your children or your grandchildren begin to ask questions about the effects of the pandemic. I want to pause a bit here on something that strikes me as very important. Exposures experienced by one generation may affect directly that generation and the next one. But some of the effects on the parental generation may also influence the offspring generation. The demography of the future depends on the composition of cohort by past experiences, and insults today have short and long-term consequences by changing cohort composition by early experiences. What happens in one generation constrains the possible pathways that can be followed by the next one. Let me identify what are the problems we may want to investigate regarding COVID-19. I distinguish three dimensions: the domains of study that can go from health to cultural, the type of effects, are they short, medium, or long-term effects, and the causal mechanism that causes those effects. Are they structural changes induced by the epidemic, or are they simply a result of transient interventions? And then there is the issue of positive and negative effects. In this presentation, I will mostly focus on negative, although there are many people around who are thinking that this is an opportunity to make something better of humanity. If I were reincarnated 100 years from now, I would concentrate on this: fetal exposure on the effects of fetal exposure on adult obesity and type 2 diabetes. And I would really like to start now a longitudinal study of women who gave birth around the time of the pandemic, their children and their families, with blood samples and all. But that's just a minuscule area of study. There are more. I will divide this in three. There is economic effects, social effects on social organizations, and more general effects I would call cultural or ideological. I have a list here that you are looking at right now, but I will only point out to two that seem to me quite important. There are long-term structural economic changes. It's likely that the epidemic will generate an overhaul of economic activity. It will be economic restructuring and permanent occupational displacement, weaker connection to labor markets, and this will in fact impact residential mobility. And in addition, I am sure there will be changes in safety net. Some of them will be permanently lost. I wonder also about what the consequence of all this will be for the labor market for females and young adolescents. I will come back to the adolescents in a second. There's a field where that I know very little that has to do with international economic crisis that this will create. How will it remap trade agreements? How will it change the volumes and directions of international trade? And what effects this may have on worker dislocation and on flows of international migration? And then all of this induces massive changes in the conditions of children, in their poverty levels, their food and social insecurity, their nutritional status, their diet, their access to healthcare, and then on the opportunities, particularly educational opportunities. Will they weaken? Will they vanish? Let me say a few things about social organization. I distinguish here not just between long-term and short-term, but also within families and between families. I would choose just the issue of adolescence because just a few days ago, I was reading a study that was done here in Spain about the extraordinary impact that this is having on adolescent physical and mental health conditions. A loss of goals and a loss of confidence, severe depression, poor future outlooks, and substance abuse. There's a bunch of other things that you see listed here, but I think this is something that I think we should pay attention. And in terms of additional elements of social organization, this is for the longer term. The one that strikes me as most important is what will it do to intergenerational exchanges, to kin solidarity and social support, to residential arrangement? What findings will we have in early service 40 years from now? Will there be changes in social contract between generations? This is to paraphrase what my colleague Stefan Walter is worried about. What will happen to intergenerational transfers? What kinds of rules will actually be based on? And then between families is an issue that has to do with the transformation of physical distancing that we are experiencing now, and what will they do to social distancing? What will happen with the culture of social exchange? All this has a massive impact on stratification, inequalities, and segregation. And here there is a list of them that I think are interesting, but I want to focus on a few of them all. The online teaching and learning. Who can learn online? Who cannot? Who will benefit from it and who will not? Will this deepen educational inequality? Will it make them better? What about physical distances of children? Will it create more incentives to generate segregations in multi-ethnic communities. Those are about educational policy, but we also have and will have economic policies that we'll put in place. And I am almost sure they will come along with defunding of public assistance and create even softer safety nets than we have now. It's possible that that will not happen everywhere, and in other places just exactly the reverse will occur. It is important for us to understand when that happens, where it's happening, what conditions is inducing that. And the final element here in the stratification, inequality, and segregation has to do with no ideology. With all this hardened discrimination against minorities and residential segregation, one important thing that I don't want to let go, it has to do with the fate of migrants. The fraction of the world population living in a different country than the one they were born in is an order of magnitude higher today than it was in 1919. And recent migrants in most high-income countries are already more vulnerable and will experience all the damage that national populations will experience, but multiply several times. And what about the children of the migrant? How will the pandemic and its aftermath constrain their and their children's livelihoods? So what can we do to secure for future researchers better opportunities to assess impacts of COVID-19 more robustly than their ancestors had to study the 1918 epidemic? And here I suggest a number of data collection strategies that could be used to answer some of the questions about the domains which I laid out before. The first, simplest, and most impossible is initiate cohort studies of target populations and control populations. These are expensive, difficult to put in place, difficult to design, and even though a lot of people like them, they're very difficult to actually implement. So in lieu of that, how about using longitudinal studies that are existing now, augment them with samples to include children, families exposed early to the pandemic. There are cohorts in the UK. In the US, we have the PSID, the NLSY, the AdHealth. There are a number of other countries that conduct cohort studies elsewhere. In each one of them, you can hijack them to introduce elements that could capture the effects of the epidemic. An alternative when there are no longitudinal studies to use cross-sectional surveys to inject them with a longitudinal component. For example, a subsample of members of affected and non-affected cohorts that can be followed each time the cross-section is repeated. I bring here as example the DHS. There are a number of household surveys that countries conduct. There are health, labor market surveys, consumer surveys, well-being surveys. It's all a matter of redesigning a bit and repurposing them and sort of hijack them to provide a mechanism to generate information that can answer the questions that we have. Another alternative is to use the ongoing repeated cross-sectional surveys, but without a longitudinal component like the one that I suggested before, but rather in each of the cross-section, take a sample of individuals who were in the previous one and re-interview them in the second one, so you have a comparison group that can actually be introduced as a benchmark to see whether comparisons across cross-section that are not longitudinal are correct. The final suggestion is to secure access to children and parental records that can be linked over time and augmented with new information, for example, with hospital records in selected areas, recurrent health, well-being, and other household surveys that can be linked to population records in census and registers. I think that's all I have to say, and I'm looking forward to questions and the answers as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Poloni, for this rich and powerful presentation. It's really set out both a long, medium, short-term agenda post-COVID. Okay. So I just wanted to say that I think this may be an opportunity in a time of crisis, a kind of renaissance for demography and for demographers to undertake the challenge of assessing these short, medium, long-term impacts of the pandemic. I think today's seminar obviously is about positioning population studies, understanding the short and long-term impacts of COVID-19. And I think the popular response that you've gotten, Mary Ellen, really reflects that the IUSSP membership feels strongly about ensuring that this science that we are following is as relevant as ever, and perhaps even more so, only if we are able to present, come up with several future scenarios of important demographic shifts, such as migration that you just talked about, Dr. Poloni, and others such as living arrangements, familial relationships, intergenerational relationships, etc. So along with health and mortality, that the responses will affect marriage patterns, fertility, etc. And I think I also want to bring up the issue of data collection and how we can, you've already pointed that out, but can we use ongoing things like demographic surveillance better? How can we be strategic and perhaps piggyback on many ongoing service, and how can we create opportunities such as the longitudinal studies that you're proposing? So in this context, Sonal, I would like to ask you first, can you talk a little bit more about what, in your view, what population studies can contribute towards more immediate policy responses to the crisis? In India, where I know you work, and even South Asia, how can demographers contribute to sharpening the policy response in terms of containment, in terms of spread, and the impact of the virus? Things such as safety nets and other issues that might broaden this agenda that Dr. Poloni has just begun. So over to you, Sonal.
Thank you, Zuba. I'm glad you mentioned the immediate response and highlighted the here and now. I feel very strongly that if as a field we can't contribute to the social policy at a time like this, we lose our relevance. And as individuals, we also start feeling quite useless. So what is it that we know? What is in our toolkit that we can use and offer for immediate relevance to policymaking? It seems to me that there are three areas we should highlight. One, we can identify population at risk. Okay? This is something demographers do well. We have a lot of data on it, and we can identify people who are at risk, like the elderly, individuals suffering from chronic disease, occupational groups whose incomes will drop as economies shut down, number of children who don't have internet access. So just coming up with numbers, people at risk, where they are located would be a very useful thing to do. The other thing that is a little more deeper is to focus on processes that shape disease transmission. Now, Alberto began by talking about migrants and migration. The most interesting example is that in India, the Indian government had not thought about the issue of migrant and migrant labor when it started shutting down the economy, locking the borders between different states and different districts. All of a sudden, there were thousands of migrants who were trying to walk across states to get back to their hometown, carrying with them various diseases. Okay? Now, honestly, I don't even think any of us could have imagined that this process would take place. But once we started seeing it occurring, actually there is a lot in our toolkit that we can use to identify where the migrants come from, where they are going, and who might be the people who are most likely to do this. For example, in certain areas of India, there have been generations of tradition where men leave behind their families in their hometown to go work in Mumbai, Delhi, and other metropolitan cities. These are the people most at risk for migrating back. So I think we should be able to get granular data and identify what would be the population at risk, who would be migrating, what can we do about them. Okay. Similarly, I think that we can do a lot about mitigation strategies. Economic lockdown has brought about tremendous suffering in certain occupations, and to be able to identify who this occupation is, where they are located, would make a big difference. So for example, Indian government just put in place a huge package for providing relief to various sections of the society. The problem, of course, is that this package is very rural focused, which made sense historically because rural poverty was higher than urban poverty. And yet, in this climate of disease and specific occupations which are suffering, it's the urban informal sector which requires the greatest mitigation and safety nets. And those are not being really put in place. Again, this is an area where we have data and knowledge to be able to contribute. So I think for us to sort of take what we have, use it, use our toolkit to be able to come up with social policies for here and now would be very useful. Taking information from one setting and exporting it to another setting is something else we can do well. And that again is useful. And this is where I think institutions like IUSSP come in. Thanks. Over to you, Zeba.
Thank you very much, Sonal. Those are really interesting thoughts. And following on from that, Parfait, if I would like to ask you basically the same question, but in terms of the short and immediate effects on people's life trajectories across the world. Basically, a whole lot of scientists are studying this pandemic, economists in particular, public health also, and political scientists. What would you consider is demographers? What are demographers' best strengths and comparative advantages in terms of taking these issues forward?
Well, thank you, Ziba. It's true that this is a challenge that is engaging the entire scientific community, and demographers are not the only ones to begin to think about how we can document this epidemic and contribute to resolving the challenges that come with it. And so we have to think carefully about how to position ourselves, as the title of this conference indicates, how to find a niche where demographers can be both useful and not redundant, how we can add value beyond what work is done by public health scientists, by economists, by sociologists, anthropologists, and historians. And so the question is, do demographers have anything unique to contribute to that research? And I think demographers' comparative advantage exists. From my perspective, our advantage comes from the fact that demography is an interdiscipline. We are accustomed to working across disciplinary boundaries, working with public health scholars, with economists and sociologists, and therefore we can have a broad perspective that makes it possible to study a wide range of consequences. Another advantage that we have, especially in low-income countries, and I think Paloni alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that in low-income settings, we have a comparatively strong baseline of data that we can use now to track changes, let's say in child health, in family formation, and all these questions. So there's an advantage there. There's also an advantage in terms of the methods of analysis that we have in demography that make it possible for us to not only study the transmission across generation, the intergenerational processes that Paloni was talking about, but also to navigate the micro and the macro, to see how the individual responses within a country add up to create the national outcomes. And finally, I think demographers have a unique advantage because the shape of the pandemic itself has a demographic element. If you look at how the pandemic is rolling out in different countries, you have a distinctive play out across different demographics. not only by age, but also by sex and by socioeconomic status. And so demographic analysis is required, and demographers have a unique set of ideas and tools and data to contribute. And so, again, I think demographers have a unique niche because of these methodological traditions, but also the ability to work across disciplines. And so as we think about where to contribute, we have to keep an eye on what other disciplines are doing so that we're not just tripping all over each other, and we actually add value. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Parfait, for those insights. And I'd like to return to Sonal and ask, because these are questions that are coming up from the IUSP membership and questions on people's minds. What about gender relations? I mean, in a way, even our newspapers and informal accounts say that women and girls are suffering more, you know, because of all kinds of restrictions, double duties, etc. But this may be an immediate impact. Do you think that first you might want to talk about the immediate impacts, and then what about the longer term opportunity in a way for improved gender relations as a result of this crisis? You worked a lot on gender issues, so I'd really like your views on that.
Let me focus on one of the most immediate issue that has been coming out in newspaper, and actually it suggests that we perhaps don't have enough data to know about it. There's a lot of emphasis around increased gender-based violence because people are staying at home, and it's creating increased tensions. As a data freak, actually, I'd like to get more data before claiming this, because it also seems to me that alcohol shops are closed and it's a lever that may be pushing violence down. So this is probably an area of a sort of a longer term research agenda. But the area that I actually think that is most relevant right now is a focus on occupational sex segregation. There was a very interesting article in New York Times where they were talking about the fact that occupations which are defined as essential workers are increasingly those which contain women. So 1 in 3 women are classified as essential workers as opposed to 1 in 4 men, because the nursing profession is dominated by women in US, in China, in many other countries in the world. So in some sense, the occupations that individuals work in define whether they are at risk of contracting the illness and to what extent they are at the risk of transmitting it. There is also the question of vulnerability. So in developing countries where we have a large proportion of economically vulnerable people to the economic shutdown are people who work in informal sector, people who are employed, self-employed. And again, these are far more likely to be women than men. So I think that we have both ends. The COVID epidemic is affecting women. One, it's putting them at a greater risk of sort of occupational health hazards. Second, it's putting them at a greater risk of negative income shocks. So I think a gender disaggregated analysis here would be very useful. Also, the fact is that almost in all countries, women form the bulk of the older population, and the older population is most at risk. They are also poorer, and intra-household resource allocation often tends to be in favor of male earning head of the household. So the mitigation strategies that sort of focus on timely care might need to focus on the older population, on women, and again, gender issues are very relevant here. Finally, I think your question, Zeba, was whether this will change gender relations over a longer period in time, changing gender norms about who does what. I would love to be optimistic about it. I would love to believe that right now, when everyone is home, there is probably greater gender sharing of household responsibilities, and perhaps it would continue. I think this is, again, an open question we'd like to know more about from data, whether it actually happens. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sonal. That's really interesting. And back to you, Parfait, with basically, you know, we demographers have normative assumptions about how we anticipate fertility, mortality, and a little bit even migration trends to pan out. In a way, we have a sort of imagined end of demographic history. To me, it's sort of when you complete the demographic transition, but we can think onwards. But is the world going to have to face a rethink about how we imagine demographic history? I mean, maybe that's not the end that we will foresee now. We'll have to imagine a new future. In a way, create more work for ourselves, but come up with more scenarios depending on how fertility, mortality, and migration pan out after this pandemic.
Actually, it's an excellent question. Both the title of the webinar as well as Paulini's presentation invited us to think beyond the short term and to think about the long term. And so it's important to think about what we mean exactly by the long term. There's a tendency to just think about the next generation or to think about long term in specifically about timing. But I think the difference that we can make between the short and long term response is not just one of timing. It's a profoundly qualitative difference between responses that are adaptive, that are individual, versus responses that are collective and structural. In other words, you have a change in economic structure, in the culture, in institutions, so that we actually don't return to what we think is the normal, right? So in the short term, what I mean by short-term response is responses by people for the day, and assuming that, well, once the pandemic is over, we are going to return to business as usual. We're going to return to what we were doing before. We're going to keep moving, as you said, towards what we think is the normal and the final stage of progress, the end of history, as you would say. And in demography, we have a clear sense of what the end of demographic history should be. When we think about fertility, the normative endpoint is a small family, a nuclear family with 2 overworked parents and so forth. When we think about migration, the endpoint is supposed to be mass urbanization or fluid, intensive international migration. When we think about mortality, the endpoint is supposed to be the endpoint of the epidemiological transition with a move from infectious diseases to non-communicable diseases. And so this is where we think the world is trending. And so what COVID can do is actually force us to rethink about these final destinations. The reason why it's forcing us to rethink these final destinations is because now we are forced to live under circumstances that are very different, that we would not have chosen for ourselves. People are forced to stay home. People are forced to work remotely. People are forced to parent their own children, as opposed to delegating this to schools or to somebody else. People are forced to teach remotely. In fact, now we're being forced to do conferences remotely. We are forced to interact with our neighbors. Those of us who live in industrial nations, I think, get a chance to be reacquainted with their neighbors, things that they haven't been doing. Now, the expectation is that once this is over, we are going to return to working as normal. We are going to return to what we were doing before. Now, suppose for a minute, let's just imagine that some of us at least begin to like this new arrangement, that we begin to like working remotely, that we begin to like doing international conferences the way we're doing now, that we begin to like not living in large cities, that we begin to like actually staying home and spending more time with our children. This may then call for new institutions, new structures, new ways to organize a family, to organize community life, to organize work, to organize gender relationship. And therefore, it can lead to a dramatically revisioning of what the future should be, what the end goal should be. It's not necessarily a small nuclear overworked family with 2 parents. It may not necessarily be living in an urban place and so forth. And so what demographers can do to begin to study this new destination, these new goals, these new aspirations for families and for family relationship, is begin to document in countries, and it's on a minor scale, and you don't need very extensive and expensive longitudinal data, to begin to see what are these new living arrangements that people are actually comfortable with, which are the arrangements that they would accept, and under what circumstances they would accept this living arrangement. There's been a tendency to focus on resistance to confinement, resistant to remote working, resistant to X and Y. But I think we can think a little bit in a contrarian way and to ask ourselves, are there elements of these new lifestyles, of these new community arrangements that people may actually begin to adopt? And so demographers can actually pave the way here and begin to, again, it doesn't require a lot of extensive data. It just requires a clever mix of observation, qualitative analysis, some polling, some surveys, some big data actually tracking people's movement and so forth. And so this is an area of research that I think we could embrace and that could be useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think that both panelists have really contributed to the discussion, and now I think we should open it up, Mary Ellen, to the questions. I see you have a lot. It's going to be your heroic task to sift through these and decide which ones to field first. I think we can go off up to about at least 5 or 7 minutes after 7. And then I'd like to wind up by getting a last word from all 3 panelists. So okay. Over to you, Mary Ellen.
Well, see what I can do here. So I'm going to use the crowdsourcing that we started out with, and I see Sonald actually started answering one of the questions. It was posed by Edward Jongstra, which was, how would one define being affected by COVID? At present, everyone is affected. And then Elizabeth Fusel added, another way of saying that is, how do we define treatment and control groups when exposure is more of a gradient? And then Stefan Walter and Sonald added to that, but I think I'll just leave it with that. And I think the question is for all 3 of you. And I'll bring Alberto back up. His video is off. Maybe Alberto can answer that one first.
Which one is the first?
How would you define being affected by COVID? At present, everyone is, and then in the other way, which Elizabeth Fusel had asked, is how do we define treatment and control groups when exposure is more of a gradient?
Well, isn't that dependent on what your problem is? I mean, if I'm interested in understanding the dynamics of transmission, then I will define as a treatment the actual contraction of the virus and the treatment that I get and whether I die or I recover. The control group, of course, will be somebody who doesn't get infected. So that's pretty simple. It gets more complicated when you start saying, well, how about social effects or economic effects of the pandemic? And that will depend very much on what groups you have in mind or what the problem is. Is the problem, for example, an issue that is related to nutritional status of children? If that's the case, then it will be kind of hard to find a control group. We were all affected by it, but some were more affected than others. And that will give you some approximation to the answer of the question that you have. The same thing would apply to any other object of study where being affected by the virus depends very much on the problem that you're interested in. So I would establish a pretty strong separation between, let's say, the most immediate effect is studying infection and mortality and disease that is associated with it. And the less immediate is any other outcome that would be derived from the pandemic itself. And it could be dependent on the degree to which a particular group was affected by it. And according to that, you will define your experimental and your control group.
Okay.
I don't know what else to say about that.
Do either Sonald or Parfait want to add to that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the story about the difference between infected and affected. Infected, the line is very easy to draw. Affected is more complicated, and you can talk about affected economically and so forth. And the caller is correct in the sense that the pandemic essentially it's pan, it's global, and it's global in a double sense. All the countries are affected, but also the consequences actually transcend the boundaries of culture, of countries and household. So the fact that you have a fewer number of deaths in country X does not necessarily mean that this country is not going to be affected, because you're going to have spillover effect from other countries, either through changes in trade or changes in remittances or effects on the diaspora and so forth. And so it is a great question, and I think one that requires multiple definitions of and a distinction between infected and affected.
Mary Helen, I think for demographers, this is the great challenge of age period and cohort analysis. But to get back to sort of more substantively interesting issues, it reminds me of the work by Glenn Elder on children of Great Depression. And I think we have some fairly interesting, creative people in a way that we can creatively address these questions. And yet, I think the issue is very relevant. And Sebastian Deza is a very interesting comment, which says, you know, basically we'll have to differentiate between type of issues we are looking at and type of effects. And I'll end there.
Okay. Thank you, Sonald. Another question that was very popular in the list is posed by Jose Miguel Guzman, and it's addressed to Alberto Poloni, and it says, what about mortality, impacts on life expectancy? What about future impact because of deterioration of health programs and the fact that all is being focused now on COVID?
Well, again, here one has to distinguish, are we talking about long-term or short-term impacts? And clearly, the short-term impact is going to be a drop in life expectancy. I don't see how that cannot happen. Even if everything else is constant, the mortality of older people went up. And because most of death are occurring in most countries at those ages, that's where the life expectancy is going to bend. And the completely different thing is to what an extent there will be differential drops in life expectancy by social group, by countries, by regions. That's a different thing. A second issue, and it depends on a different definition of what do we mean by effects on life expectancy. What about if I ask about long-term effects of life expectancy? Well, there's where the issue of exposure to this epidemic comes in, and it's related to the previous question. Let's say that now I'm interested in the mortality of people who are between ages 15 and 40. Will that be affected? Well, if you link this question to the issue that I raised about adolescence and the loss of hopes, the loss of goals, the depression, the substance abuse, the inability to sort of frame the future because everything is up in the air. Would these people, for example, be affected more by suicide? Will there be more accidents once we start circulating again? In which case now we're going to have a medium-term impact on mortality that will affect is the group of ages where mortality is lowest. So you will feel less that of an impact on life expectancy, but you will feel it if you calculate temporary life expectancy between, say, ages 15 and 40. And then the next thing is much longer term. What happens if, in fact, the theories of developmental origins are right and individuals who were exposed to this epidemic when in utero or in embryonic life develop propensities to contract chronic diseases that they would otherwise not have been contracted, like, say, I don't know, diabetes type 2, cardiovascular disease. Then what you will see, if everything remains constant, and by that I mean medical technology, is that 40 years from now, you will have an increase in cardiovascular disease, or you will have an increase in renal failure. Will that impact life expectancy? It will depend on the treatments that we have then and who can access them. If there are huge differentials, yeah, probably mortality would increase at older ages again. And so you will have I can imagine if all this pans out, you will have decreases in life expectancy at older ages and will be an immediate period, let's say between 2-3 years. There's a lot of selection going on at this point. The people who are older who survive this will be quote unquote stronger. So that will present a situation where the tendency to life expectancy to go down will be offset a bit. Then past that, there will be the effect of mortality in the middle ages. And then finally, you will have a long-term effect of adult and older age mortality. I'm not sure if I'm answering that right, but I think that those are the things that the question triggered.
Okay. So we have one other, I'm not sure we have time for another question because it's already 3:56. So I'm wondering if Parfait and Sonald have other things that they would like to add, and then Alberto. We did receive over 77 questions, and some of these might be great for a next webinar. So first I'll hand it over to Parfait, then Sonald and Alberto to close off. And perhaps Zeba? Parfait? If you had some final comments?
Oh, if it's up to me, yes. I think this is, thanks for organizing this. These are challenging times. These are, as one would say, times that challenge the bravest of souls. But for research, it's going to be an important test to the field as a whole, and to see what contributions it can make to address pressing questions, but also to begin to raise new questions beyond the immediately pressing questions, and to think about how to demonstrate relevance, as Sonalde was saying, but also how to initiate new conversation amongst ourselves. And so for that reason, I think the forum today, to me, was an interesting response in itself. And it provides an avenue to meet in new ways and to interact in new ways. And I hope this continues.
Okay. So now.
Ellen, what sort of came through to me, okay, was most importantly in all these questions was a need for data. Demographers can't survive without data, and we are constantly asking for more data. But this is particularly a time when there are areas where data is currently a problem or likely to become a problem as we go along. I want to highlight the fact that 2020 was supposed to be the census year around the world. Okay, it is not clear to me that all censuses will be carried out, what kind of quality they would be carried out with. And this is going to be a major challenge for future data systems. It also tells me something else, that I think that as demographers, we have tended to be somewhat narrow in our definition of the data that we used. We focus on censuses, we focus on vital statistics, and we focus on surveys. But increasingly, there are different types of data that's being used. There were a lot of questions on how can we get migration data.
Yes.
And one of the most interesting thing I've recently seen is research based on railway tickets, which were sold in India at various points in time for various kinds of distances, which give you very interesting data on where the trips begin and where the trips end, and what's the months in which they are sort of most frequently used. So I think we might have to start looking for better data systems, invest in data systems, but also look for more diverse kinds of data. And that's going to be an interesting challenge for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonald. Thank you, Parfait. Thank you, Zeba. Thank you so much to Alberto, who was the instigator for us starting this webinar with his blog. We really appreciate all of your participation in this. Some people have said they'd like to go on longer. If you want to stay, we can, but sometimes short is better. We thank you all. But Alberto, you have a question. I'm going to unmute you. Oops, you're still muted. Unmute yourself. Alberto, you're muted. Oh,
And was the last person after Parfait, as the panelists were responding. I wanted to say a couple of things that were triggered by the questions that Ziba had and some of the answers that Sonai and Parfait gave. One of them had to do with short-term, long-term. The urgency right now, what is very urgent, is to assess effect short-term. And I understand that we need to implement interventions to minimize the damage that this pandemic is doing. We want to know how to prepare for the next year or next 2 years. But I want you not to forget that as demographers, as researchers, we also have in mind questions that involve long-term things that we will not be able to assess today, but we will be able to assess 40 years from now. And so that the idea of concentrating all resources in questions that have to do with short-term effects, it's probably an important one, short-term, but not long-term. And the second issue had to do with whether demographers have something to say about this. I was listening to Parfait, and I was glad that the first word that he posed was interdisciplinary. I think that there's no question that we can ask here that demographers can respond alone, and that inevitably we'll have to work in interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary teams to sort out some of the effects of the epidemic. So just to summarize, remember multidisciplinarity and remember long-term. Thank you.
okay. Tom Legrand, would you like to say one last word before we sign off and unmute?
Trying to unmute.
Oh no, unmute. Unmute. You're muted. You're unmuted. Tom, you're muted. Oh, there. Okay.
Okay. I just want to thank everybody again for coming. This is, I think, a good first experience for the IUSSP. And I urge you very strongly to keep your eye on the IUSSP website and make sure that IUSSP messages to you don't fall into your spam box. We hope to continue these sorts of webinars quite a bit into the future. I think one of the things that came up that I agree with Sonal is the need for new data and new methods to get at these things. And there's the idea of having possibly a digital demography webinar. And I hope that one of the things they will look at is how to get at, for example, migration and the effects of COVID on migration, making use of data from social media, this sort of thing. I think we have to start experimenting with these new approaches, maintaining a fairly strong skepticism to be sure that we have to maintain the quality and the high standards of what we've already done, the rigor. But I think there are real potential to do things with these new sorts of data. Anyway, thanks very much for coming. Please keep your eye on the website, and I look forward, and please remember there is the next webinar in honor of Gordon DeJong, which will be on the 8th of June. I hope people will be able to sign in. Thank you very much. I'll sign out.
Okay, and I'm going to end the webinar. Thanks again to everybody who is attending, posed questions, and to our distinguished panelists. This has been great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to say goodbye. Goodbye. And meeting for all. And